Hi, friends. So we finished Huggins, where we met Henry. We finished um, Ramona the Pest, where we met Ramona and her sister Beezus and their family, who happened to be friends and neighbors with Henry Huggins on Clickitat Street. So I've got a new Beverly Cleary's. Well, new for us. It's actually a very old story. Um, but this one is called Henry and Beezus. So let's find out what happens. Chapter 1, Ribsy and the Roast. Henry Huggins stood by the front window of his square white house on Clickitat Street and wondered why Sunday afternoon seemed so much longer than any other part of the week. Mrs. Huggins was reading a magazine, and Mr. Huggins was reading the comics in the Sunday newspaper. Henry's dog, Ribsy, we know Ribsy, was asleep in the middle of the living room rug. As Henry looked at him, he suddenly sat up, scratched hard behind his left ear with his left hind foot, and flopped down again without even bothering to open his eyes. Henry pressed his nose against the window and looked out at Clickitat Street. The only person he saw was Scooter McCarthy, who was riding up and down the sidewalk on his bicycle. "Ah, I sure wish I had a bike," remarked Henry to his mom and dad as he watched Scooter. "I wish you did too," agreed his mother. "But with prices and taxes going up all the time, I'm afraid we can't get you one this year." "Maybe things will get better next year," said Mr. Huggins, dropping the comics and picking up the sports section. Henry sighed. He wanted a bicycle now. He could see himself riding up and down Clickitat Street on a shiny red bike. He'd wear his genuine Daniel Boone raccoon skin cap with the snap-on tail. Only he wouldn't wear the tail fastened to the hat. He'd tie it to the handlebars so it would wave in the breeze as he whizzed along. "Henry," said Mrs. Huggins, interrupting his thoughts, "please don't rub your nose against my nice clean windows." "All right, Mom," said Henry. "I sure wish something would happen around here sometime." "Why don't you go over to Robert's house? Maybe he can think of something to do," suggested Mrs. Huggins as she turned a page of her magazine. "Okay," agreed Henry. Robert's mother said they couldn't give the white mice sorry. "Okay," agreed Henry. Robert's mother said they couldn't give the white mice rides on Robert's electric train anymore, but maybe they could think of something else that was fun. "Come on, Ribsy," said Henry. Ribsy stood up and shook himself, scattering hair all over the rug. "Oh, that dog," sighed Mrs. Huggins. Henry thought he'd better leave quickly, as he and Ribsy started down the front steps. Who should come around the corner but Robert? "Hey, what's up, Doc?" said Robert. "Hi," responded Henry. "My dad said maybe if I came over to your house, you could think of something to do," said Robert. The boys sat down on the front steps. "Here comes old Scooter," observed Robert. The two boys watched the older boy pumping down the street on his bicycle. He was whistling, and not only was he riding without touching the handlebars, he even had his hands in his pockets. "Hi," said Scooter casually, without stopping. "Big show-off," muttered Robert. "I bet he takes that bike to bed with him." "Oh, he sure thinks he's smart," agreed Henry. "He's been riding up and down all afternoon. Come on, let's go around in the backyard where we won't have to watch old Scooter show off all day. Maybe we can find something to do back there." Ribsy followed Henry and Robert. Unfortunately, The backyard was no more interesting than the front yard. The only sign of life was next door. A large yellow cat was dozing on the Grumby's back steps, and there was smoke coming from the barbecue pit. Robert looked thoughtful. Hey, does Ribsy ever chase cats? Not that old Fluffy. Henry, understanding what was on Robert's mind, explained that Mrs. Grumby sprinkled something called Doggy Be Good, Doggy Be Gone on her side of the rose bushes. Ribsy disliked the smell of it so bad and was careful to stay on his side of the bushes. Robert was disappointed. I thought Ribsy might. Yeah, no such luck, interrupted Henry, looking at his dog, who had settled himself by the back steps to continue his nap. Henry picked up a blade of grass and started to blow through it, when the squeak slam of the Grumby's screen door made him look up. Jeepers, he whispered. Stepping carefully over Fluffy the cat, Mr. Hector Grumby, who had once paid Henry to catch worms, walked down the back steps. He was wearing a chef's tall white hat and an immense white apron. What's cookin'? Was written across the hat. What's cookin' was written across the hat, and on the apron was printed a recipe for Bar X Ranch barbecue sauce. Mr. Gumby carried a tray full of bowls, jars, bottles, and what appeared to be a bunch of dried weeds. All right, I'm just checking my time here. Is he really gonna cook? Whispered Robert. Search me, answered Henry. The two boys edged closer to the rose bushes that divided the yards. Hello, Mr. Grumby, said Henry. Oh, hello there, Henry. Mr. Grumby crossed the lawn and set the tray on the edge of the barbecue pit in the corner of his yard. He peeled a small object which he put into a bowl, sprinkled with salt, and mashed with a little wooden stick. Then he broke off pieces of the dried weeds and mashed them too. Henry and Robert exchanged puzzled looks. Need any help, Mr. Grumby? Asked Henry. No thank you. Mr. Grumby poured a few drops of something into the mixture. Mr. Grumby, is that something that's supposed to be good to eat? Asked Robert. Mr. Grumby didn't answer. What's that stuff in the bowl, Mr. Grumby? Asked Henry. Herbs and garlic, answered Mr. Grumby. Now run along and play, boys. I'm very busy here. But Henry and Robert did not move. Etta, called Mr. Grumby to his wife. I forgot the vinegar. He coughed as a breeze blew smoke from the barbecue into his face. I'll go get it for you, offered Henry, but his neighbor ignored him. Squeak! Slam went the screen door. Mrs. Grumby stepped over Fluffy the cat and walked across the yard with a bottle in her hand. Hector, can't we take your friends out to dinner instead of going to all this trouble? She asked as she fanned smoke out of her eyes. Oh, this is no trouble at all. Mr. Grumby added a few drops of vinegar to the mixture in the bowl. Henry thought Mrs. Grumby looked angry as she said, Hector, why don't you let me cook the meat in the house? It'd be so much easier, and then we could bring it outside to eat. Now, Etta, I know what I'm doing. Mr. Grumby poured a few drops from another bottle and mashed some more. But I don't like to see you spoil the flavor of a perfectly good piece of meat with all that seasoning. It'd be different if you really knew how to cook. Mrs. Grumby frowned as she swatted at a bug circling over the sauce. Mr. Grumby frowned even more. Anyone who can read a recipe can cook. Mrs. Grumby's face turned red as she clapped the bug between her hands and said sharply, Oh, Is that so? What about the time you cut up tulip bulbs in the hamburgers because you thought they were onions? That was different, said Mr. Grumpy even more sharply. Mrs. Grumpy angrily fanned smoke with her apron. Just remember when we try to eat this mess you're fixing, it wasn't my idea. Even if the recipe is any good, the meat will probably be burned on the outside and raw on the inside. Smoke will get in our eyes and we'll be eaten alive by mosquitoes and... Mr. Grumpy interrupted. Etta, we won't argue about it any more. I invited my friends to a barbecue, and we're going to have a barbecue. Henry and Robert were disappointed. They hoped the Grumpies would argue about it a lot more. Sure beat just sitting around doing nothing. Then Mr. Grumpy looked at the recipe printed on his apron. Because he was looking down at it, the words were upside down for him. What does it say here? He asked, pointing at his stomach. Henry and his buddy Robert could not help snickering. Now, boys. Now, boys, run along and don't bother us. We're very busy, said Mrs. Grumble. Come on, Robert. Henry turned away from the rose bushes. He felt uncomfortable around Mrs. Grumpy because he thought she didn't like him. At least she didn't like Ribsy, and that was the same as not liking Henry. He didn't want to make her any more angry than she was already, although secretly he couldn't see why she minded Ribsy's burying a bone in her flower beds once in a while. And that's where we're going to stop. I think this is the limit of my video capabilities. So Henry and Robert are watching the Mr. Grumpy barbecue out of sheer boredom. And we'll stop there, and I'll see you later.